Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this series. I am very happy to be part of it and to give you a little more information about the food that you're eating. I do want to preface this by saying that this is for informational purposes. I'm not trying to incite any kind of a riot. Our food is something that we have a right to know where it comes from, how it's grown, where it's grown, and this is just kind of adding another dimension to that. We would like to know whether or not it has been genetically modified. I have a video clip that is from a comedian named, who is it, Jimmy Kimmel? And I thought it was relevant because we have a lot of people walking around who are opposed to GMOs in their food. However, when his folks hit the street and started to interview people, we realized that most people really don't know what GMOs are. And this is not uncommon for people to have a stance. They're opposed to global climate change, but they can't answer what it is. They don't want aquaculture, but they don't know what it is. So let's watch this little clip, and it'll just add a little levity to a serious topic. Okay, well, some interesting comments there. He made a point that things are labeled natural, yet they can still contain a GMO, which is true, and that is because genetically modified organisms are usually modified with DNA from something else that's living. So we can still use the word natural to describe that product. The FDA does govern GMOs and some other things to a certain extent, but not to the fullest extent. It was also mentioned that there is a lack of evidence and there's a perception that these are not good for you. And we have to remember that we're talking about a technology that is somewhat new in terms of applying it to our food production. And a lack of evidence doesn't necessarily mean that there is no evidence. It just means that we are long-lived creatures, and there's just not been enough evidence and time amassed in order to have some good data demonstrating that there is or there is not a problem with GMOs. I thought it was interesting that the survey was done at a farmer's market. One would expect that a farmer's market would attract a more savvy consumer, someone who is a little more into eating properly, yet the majority of them, if not all of them, except for the last person, had no idea what a GMO was. One person made reference to something bad coming from corn, and she was probably thinking of high fructose corn syrup, which is something else that is a whole nother lecture. So, but let's get started with talking about GMOs, and I'm just going to hit enter here. Okay. And that was the Jimmy Kimmel segment. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we understand the difference between how we have tweaked our food over time, because tweaking our food is not necessarily a new thing. We have over time practiced what are called selective breeding practices, or employed selective breeding techniques for thousands of years. And this is common in agriculture, in animal husbandry. We have tried to breed certain animals to create stronger oxen. We have tried to breed certain plants to create something that has a larger fruit with less seeds. So this is called artificial selection. Artificial because we are controlling what is being done. But again, these breeding methods are done under a skilled hand, and the results may take several generations, if at all, to even come into play. Darwin, who is depicted in the upper left corner here, was the person who talked about artificial versus natural selection. And so again, artificial selection, you have future generations' characteristics shaped by humans and what we deem as a favorable trait, a fruit with no seeds, for example. Natural selection is the stuff that Darwin is based of, and it says that the environmental conditions will help shape the next generation. So artificial selection versus natural selection. What happens is when we put our hand into the pot and start to determine the next generation's traits based on what we perceive as favorable, we tend to create organisms that are unable to survive in the wild any longer. Think about it. If we create fruits that have no seeds, how are they going to populate the next generation? They have no seeds. So again, artificial selection is tweaking something to our benefit versus natural selection. So what is genetic engineering? What is all of these terms you hear around GMOs or genetically modified organisms, genetic engineering, recombinant DNA? Let's talk a little bit about what that means. And so basically, the difference with what I described as what we've been doing in agriculture and animal husbandry for thousands of years is I'm not taking two organisms and creating a selective breeding situation. What I'm doing now is looking at the DNA of an organism and selecting the specific trait that gives me the desired characteristic, and I'm removing it from organism A. I'm putting it into some kind of a vector, which is a fancy word for a package that helps me move it, into organism B. So that now organism B is going to have a different genetic makeup than it originally had, because it is now going to include that portion of DNA I selected from organism A. Hope that makes sense. So I had just explained how we take a section of DNA from organism A, put it into a vector, and move it into organism B. Organism B is now deemed a transgenic or a modified organism. So when we talk about genetically modified organisms, we're talking about the organism that has now been changed as a result of having DNA from another organism moved into it. Okay? The new organism, the DNA that's moved in, generally codes for specific proteins. And if you know anything about immunology, when anyone has an allergic reaction to something, you're allergic to something on the protein surface or something that has to do with a protein. And that's why, if you had a chance to read the case study that I sent over ahead of time, one of the areas I address are allergies, and has to do with allergies, because when you introduce a foreign gene or foreign protein, you can induce an allergic response that you had not anticipated, because while I may not be allergic to broccoli, I very well may be allergic to the fish from which the protein came that was put into the broccoli, so that the broccoli can withstand lower temperatures when it's growing. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. Okay, this slide shows a bunch of different cell types. Now, I don't have a pointer, but the circular guy in the lower left is a typical animal cell. The thick green-walled guy in the lower right, who's kind of edged in black, that's a typical plant cell. In the top, yes. Thank you. In the top there, that oblong cell that says bacterial DNA and plasmids, that's a very typical bacterial cell. Now, bacteria are most often the donors and the vectors for DNA transfer because of their comparative simplicity. If you look at the other cell types, there's a lot of different things inside of them called organelles. There are thick walls to penetrate. The DNA in the other two cells are held in a nice tight nucleus. In the bacterial cell, you see that DNA is just kind of free floating in there, and you have these circular strands of DNA called plasmids. And the plasmid is most often what is cleaved in order to move DNA into the new organism. Okay, we've had a lot of commercially grown GMO crops. One of the first ones was something called a flavor saver tomato. It was supposed to last a bit longer, so people were excited about it because you didn't have to throw your tomato away within a week if you didn't eat it. It lasted a little bit longer than that. And it was supposedly retained its nice red color and flavor, although it really turned out to not be the case, and they're not really making this flavor savored tomato anymore. But just to give you some examples of things that came out into the market, I would say between 15 and 20 years ago that we had no idea GMO and genetically modified and transgenic organism, none of these words were part of our everyday vernacular conversation 2 decades ago the way they are now. So these foods came out in a time where we kind of like what I would consider like pre-educated to what is going on. A few other companies, Calgene, Monsanto, created a new leaf potato that was supposed to be genetically modified to withstand attack from the Colorado potato beetle, and some varieties of soybean, corn, cotton. All of these have been commercially available right here in the U.S. since about 1996, 1997. The U.S. has adopted GM crops with open arms. The rate of adoption has soared from about 10% of our agricultural acres devoted to GM foods, and that was in about 1996 when we had the advent of some of these genetically modified organisms hitting the markets. It has soared to between 60 and 90% in 2010. And again, that was 4 years ago. There are some crops that are almost exclusively genetically modified unless they are labeled organic by certain organizations like the USDA. So there's a lot of people who are up in arms about GMOs, and then there are people who, like the gentleman in the Jimmy Kimmel, saying, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. I eat GMOs on a regular basis, and I might not even know it, and therefore it's okay. I kind of look at it like this. There are some things that will address your or attack your body in an acute manner, and there are some things that you require prolonged exposure. If you walk into a room where cyanide or some chemical is in high concentration, you fall to the ground, we can draw a pretty straight line between the chemical in the room and you're falling to the ground. That's an acute toxicity. But what about something like a radon that's emitting from your basement and the area where your home was built over the period of many, many decades? How straight a line can you draw between an ailment when you're 70, 80, to the exposure on a daily basis? And I guess that's my point with the GMOs. It's obviously not an acute toxicity, but is it a prolonged exposure situation? It may not be, but this is something that is, and no pun intended, food for thought. Okay, so some of the advocates will say that GM crops will have a higher yield. They'll help maintain food security. We have a burgeoning population, and maybe GM is the way to go so that we can avoid or stop world hunger. Sounds good. GM crops can reduce environmental impacts of pesticides and herbicides. If I have a plant that is genetically modified to withstand attack from the potato beetle, maybe I don't have to dump so much pesticide on top of it, and I don't have a lot of pesticide leaching out into the surrounding soil. Now, I'm not stating these as fact, I'm just stating them as things that are arguments for and against. GM products, maybe they can be healthier if I can increase the nutritional contents of a food. All of a sudden, I can make corn a high mineral, high vitamin content food instead of a high starchy food. Okay, the people who kind of throw their hands up and say, hold on. They're the people who say, you know, food allergies have become more prevalent in the last few decades. I wonder if there's a correlation between that and the increase in genetically modified foods that have hit the market. When I was growing up, I did not have a single person in my class who was lactose intolerant, allergic to peanuts, soybeans, shellfish. I never heard of these terms before. There were no peanut-free schools or anything like this. Now, this is something that my kids are dealing with in their school environments on a regular basis. Why is that? Okay, and of people who are against say, you know what, there is not sufficient or long enough term testing conducted in order to truly evaluate the effects of GM products on individual people and on the environment. Okay, so there are definitely pros and cons on either side, and I want to try to present that to you as best I can, even though I'm a little biased. Okay, so who's on top? Who are the people who are making genetically modified foods? Who's profiting from it? Who's planting this 60 to 90% of our agricultural land since 1996? The top U.S. companies are Monsanto, DuPont, yes, the DuPont people, and Land O'Lakes. I just want to add something in there. Monsanto is more of a relatively new company in comparison to a DuPont. DuPont was the company who in the 1950s was doing all of the DDT aerial spraying, and the main target in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that was published in 1962, DuPont had a field day with a smear campaign for poor Rachel Carson after that book came out. But it just goes to show you, DuPont is still quite a giant in the industry, and now they're dabbling in genetically modified foods and pesticide-resistant GM foods. So out of the top 5 companies producing GMOs, Monsanto, DuPont, and Land O'Lakes are 3 U.S. companies in that top 5. Okay, Monsanto has been in the news a lot. They are really a monster in the industry, and they produce soybeans that are called Roundup Ready. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen, when you're traveling through Home Depot or any of those stores, those things of pesticides that you can take and kind of spray around your driveway or the edges just to kill the weeds. That spray that you're putting on, its trade name is Roundup. So Monsanto has created a soybean that is called Roundup Ready, which means that it is impervious to the pesticide, herbicide Roundup. So if I were to have Roundup Ready soybeans and I sprayed them with Roundup, they would go on living just fine, but all of the competitive weeds around it would die. So now I ask you, if Monsanto is trying to say that we will use less pesticides if we have genetically modified foods, I can dump even more pesticide on the Roundup Ready soybean because it is immune to it. So I don't need to take care with that balance of killing the weeds but not killing my crop. I can kind of dump a little more indiscriminately. And there are a lot of articles that show that some of the genetically modified foods actually have a higher pesticide residue because of reasons like Roundup Ready soybeans. Okay, now speaking of Monsanto, now that we just blasted them, now when this high fructose corn syrup stuff all started coming out, then all of a sudden people started to say, I don't want high fructose corn syrup in my food. And you know what? When enough people say that, things can change, things can happen. So you know what changed? They stopped calling it high fructose corn syrup and they have it under another name in the same food. it's like camouflaged under a new name now. And I can't remember what it is, I'm sorry, but if it pops into my head during the rest of this lecture, I'll blurt it out. But it's still in your food, but it's being called something different so that you don't realize. As you're watching that, it kind of gives you the warm and fuzzies, huh? They tried to use a lot of very key catchphrases in there, such as sustainable agriculture. Sustainable or sustainability has to do with having some left for tomorrow. In other words, not harvesting it all and causing degradation to the environment to the extent today that you no longer have something to harvest tomorrow. They used other catchphrases like let's produce more, let's conserve more, let's improve lives. It wasn't surprising to me to see some of the highest yields for corn, for example, in areas like India, Russia, and Africa, areas that corn traditionally does not grow. So a genetically modified corn product has the chance to grow in those environments. Overall, it was somewhat well received, but again, produced specifically in defense of who they were perceived to be and who they wanted to be perceived as, or what they wanted to be perceived as. Okay, so golden rice is a product that I've actually written an article about. It is the product that is in the picture that looks like that orangey yellow kind of color. So in areas like those depicted in the parts of the world that are dark green in the map, like areas of Africa and South America, you have something called xerophthalmia, and it is a very fancy word for childhood blindness. Now, it is not reversible, but it is 100% preventable. The only cause of xerophthalmia is a vitamin A deficiency. Okay? Now, if you can provide vitamin A, or at least the raw products, which are beta-carotene, because our bodies make vitamin A, we don't take in vitamin A, we take in the raw products and we make vitamin A. It is the only vitamin that we really make ourselves and don't get directly from a plant source. So if we could fortify a food product with the beta-carotene so that when it's ingested, it induces the production of vitamin A, we could prevent this childhood blindness in the areas of the world, again, that are dark green on the map. The areas on the world that are dark green on the map are areas that are very heavily rice-based societies. So the idea was to insert a gene to produce beta-carotene into the rice so that when the rice was consumed, beta-carotene was also being consumed. I have to say that from what I've read, this project was successful in lowering the incidence of childhood blindness. I also will say that a lot of people in those areas didn't exactly have easy access to the golden rice, which brings me to another point. We'll talk about it in about 10 minutes. And just kind of put it in the back of your head, is world hunger a factor of not enough food produced, or is it a factor of location, poverty, politics, food distribution? Okay, what is it really a factor of? So, how can we control how these genes get out into the environment? That's been a major concern for people, that if I tweak this organism, I don't want it mating with this other plant and now the tweaked gene is passed on. I don't want it getting mixed in with what's organic, so now the organic is no longer organic. Okay. There is a gene produced called Cry9C. It was added to corn that was for animal fodder only. Somehow, during the transport, handling, and processing of that gene-modified corn, it got into the human corn supply. Unknowingly, Taco Bell ended up purchasing a huge amount of this Starlink corn, as it was known as a trade name, and began incorporating it into all of their taco shells. When people found out, they went ballistic, and as a result, Starlink corn is no longer made. But I think it shows us that when people make a decision to support something, again, changes can be made, but I don't think that discontinuing to make Starlink corn was the appropriate end to that means. I think that maybe some of the handling, transport, and processing of GM grain needed to be reevaluated to ensure the separation of those items may have been a better outcome, as opposed to just saying, okay, now we're just not going to make it anymore. In terms of the environment, we do need to take into consideration what is happening. There are insects that are developing resistance to insecticides even more quickly than before. When we talk about Roundup Ready, put into soybeans, that is the soybean resistant to the pesticide being put on it. But that same soybean is also genetically modified to withstand attack from certain insects. Okay, you have weed competition and you have insect competition. Insects, by the way, are our #1 competitor for food. So now you have some plants being genetically modified to additionally withstand attack from their predators or insects. And what's happening is the insects are developing resistance at a much increased rate than we saw before. And the rates were pretty high before. Insect populations are being exposed to these proteins on a much more frequent basis than they would in normal or natural conditions. We're also seeing weeds becoming resistant to things like Roundup and other pesticides, and they're being called superweeds because they are, again, developing resistance to herbicides. If you wanted to, you could take a look at the World Watch Institute, and it shows all of these organisms that have had increased resistance since 1980. It's a little bit of a science geek site, but it just lends credibility to what we're talking about here because it is chock full of hard data. So there are socioeconomic impacts of hunger, and a lot of people feel that hunger is the result of these types of events, that we do produce enough food to adequately feed the world, that we do currently produce more food than we ever have before in the past. So what is the problem? Is it the lack of production, or is it a lack of distribution of those existing food supplies? And interestingly, I read an article from 1998 published by the USDA reporting that GM crops did not significantly increase crop yields, and in some cases, such as in the Roundup Ready soybean, the end result were fewer bushels of soybeans than the non-GM soybeans. Very, very interesting fact that Monsanto left out of their little, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya video. So, imposing restrictions. What is the deal with the U.S.? The European Union has a list of safeguards that impose importing GMOs. They want a socioeconomic status of the company, the country where the GMOs were produced. So even though Monsanto might be creating these genetically modified organisms, if you notice in the video, they're growing them in Brazil, in India, in Russia, in Africa. These are places that are socioeconomically depressed. So they're making even more profit on the lands that they're growing their GM products on. So the European Union wants to know about the socioeconomic status of the exporting country. They want clear labeling on genetically modified products. They want risk assessment. They want information about effects on the consumer and effects on the environment. You walk the streets in our country and people don't even know what a GMO is. Why is that? Why is there such a split? I'm not going to show you this video. It's called Just Label It. It is a collaboration between people like Michael J. Fox and some other famous actors and a bunch of star chefs, Food Network kind of stars now. And they all get together and they say, just label it. Put the two products there. You know, it's a business-based society. Have your GMO products, have your organic products, and let me, the consumer, make the decision in buying it. But how can we make that decision if, again, you have the general population walking around not even knowing what a GMO is? And this was part of the resistance to labeling it. Folks feel that if they go ahead and label foods as genetically modified, it is going to open up a can of worms that the general population simply cannot understand if they don't even know or care what a GMO is. So in Europe, genetically modified products are discussed more freely in popular literature, newspapers, magazines, TV commercials. Whereas in the US, genetically modified products are really discussed, unless there's a leak like the Starlink and Taco Bell, they're really discussed in scientific literature. How many people are walking around reading scientific literature on a regular basis? So the folks in the US are purposefully kept in the dark, maybe you could say. In the US, the majority of GM literature, as I mentioned, is published in scientific literature. And in the US, the USDA and the FDA are considered trusted regulatory authorities. The surveys that I read showed that 90% of the people felt that the USDA had their best interests in mind. 84% felt that the FDA made statements about the safety of biotechnology, and they believe it. Now in Europe, there's more support for international regulation because they are not as taken by the regulatory agencies as we are in the US. Okay, and I just want to, I think this is one of my last slides, just talk to you about some of the therapeutic benefits of having this technology. One is something called xenotransplantation, and it is a way that we can tweak some genetic information so that transplanted organs are not rejected at the rate that they currently are. And there has been some, in addition to the golden rice, advances made with countries that have a high incidence of hepatitis B. A vaccine for hepatitis B was put into a banana, and you can effectively have that banana be considered a vehicle for administering that vaccine. So I don't want to be all like doom and gloom. There are some good things that we're doing, but I just think that the educated consumer is probably our best defense against the unknown and against protecting ourselves. This is a huge list of some of the references that I used, and I think Caitlin is going to help.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm really excited to see you all next month, and I hope you have a wonderful day.